Confirming no signs here. Main fuselage clear, moving to the tail.
At 12:49 in the afternoon, an Air New Zealand DC-10 was flying low over Antarctica. The crew believed they were approaching McMurdo Sound. Visibility appeared good. The aircraft was descending through 6,000 feet. Then, without a distress call, without a warning, Flight TE901 struck the lower slopes of Mount Erebus. Every person on board was killed. But the most haunting question came later. How could an experienced crew, flying a route they believed they knew, end up flying directly into a 12,000-foot mountain? The answer would expose a chain of small decisions, a hidden change in the flight plan, and one of the most controversial investigations in aviation history. This is the story of Air New Zealand Flight 901, the Mount Erebus disaster, and the chain of events that turned a sightseeing flight into New Zealand's worst civil disaster. It was November 28, 1979. Antarctica was entering its brief summer season, and for passengers aboard Flight TE901, this was supposed to be an extraordinary day. Air New Zealand had been operating sightseeing flights to Antarctica since 1977. Passengers could fly from Auckland toward the Ross Sea, see the frozen continent from the air, circle near McMurdo Sound, and return home the same day. It was marketed as an adventure. For many passengers, it was a once-in-a-lifetime experience. On this particular flight were 237 passengers and 20 crew. Most of the passengers were New Zealanders, but there were also travelers from Japan, the United States, Britain, Canada, Australia, France, and Switzerland. Among the crew was Captain Jim Collins, the pilot assigned to command the flight, and First Officer Greg Casson. The aircraft was a McDonnell Douglas DC-1030, large, long-range, and flown by an experienced crew. Nothing about the morning suggested that this flight would become a disaster, but several days earlier, something had changed, and the people on the aircraft did not know it. On November 9th, Captain Jim Collins and First Officer Greg Casson attended a route qualification briefing for the Antarctic flight. They were shown the planned route toward the McMurdo area. According to the briefing, the instrument route would take the aircraft over McMurdo Sound, across an area of relatively flat sea ice. The crew were also told about a visual procedure that could allow them to descend to around 6,000 feet when visibility was good. This mattered enormously, because when pilots build a mental picture of a route, they are not simply memorizing numbers, they are imagining geography. The crew expected the aircraft to approach McMurdo Sound from a particular direction, and that expectation would later become critically important. There was already a problem with the coordinates being used for the flight. A typing error made approximately 14 months earlier had shifted a destination coordinate. On November 14th, another Air New Zealand captain, David Simpson, noticed a discrepancy after flying an Antarctic route. The difference between the programmed destination and the actual McMurdo area was significant. The airline's navigation section investigated, but the problem was misunderstood. In the early hours of November 28th, the very morning of the flight, the coordinate was changed. The navigation staff believed they were making a small correction. Instead, the change shifted the route about 27 nautical miles to the east. And that difference was catastrophic. The route that the crew had been briefed to understand as passing over sea ice would now take the aircraft toward Mount Erebus. Mount Erebus rises to 3,794 meters, about 12,448 feet, and is one of the world's southernmost active volcanoes. The crew were not specifically told about the change. They received the revised flight plan that morning and entered its coordinates into the aircraft's navigation system. From their perspective, the flight plan appeared legitimate. The numbers were there, the aircraft was ready, and the passengers were waiting. Shortly before 8:30 in the morning, Flight TE901 departed Auckland.
It was scheduled to be an approximately 11-hour return sightseeing flight. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was completely different from the story that history would later tell. Passengers ate breakfast, they watched films, they read. Some photographed the Antarctic landscape through the windows.
There was even an in-flight booklet describing the scenery they were about to see. For the passengers, this was not a dangerous expedition. It was a sightseeing trip. But thousands of kilometers away, Antarctica was waiting. As the DC-10 crossed southward, the crew communicated with air traffic control. Eventually, they established contact with MAX Center at McMurdo Station. Everything appeared routine. Then, the aircraft reached the Antarctic region. The landscape below was enormous. White ice, dark mountains, sea, cloud, and an environment where the distinction between ground and sky could become extremely difficult to judge. At first, TE901 was expected to approach McMurdo Sound according to the planned route, but the aircraft was actually heading toward Mount Erebus. The crew did not realize it. And this is where the tragedy became more than a simple navigation error, because the mountain itself could be difficult to see. Antarctic conditions can create what investigators described as poor surface and horizon definition. A white mountain against a white background can lose the visual contrast pilots normally depend upon. The horizon can become almost impossible to distinguish. The terrain can appear deceptively flat, and the closer the aircraft came, the less time remained to understand what was happening. At approximately 12:42 p.m. New Zealand Standard Time, the crew told MAX Center that they were flying in visual conditions and would proceed visually toward McMurdo. MAX Center asked them to maintain visual conditions and report their altitude. 3 minutes later, at 12:45, the crew reported that they were at 6,000 feet and descending toward 2,000 feet. This was the last communication from Flight TE901. There was no emergency call, no warning, no indication that the crew understood they were approaching the mountain. 4 minutes and 42 seconds later, at 12:49 p.m., the DC-10 struck the lower slopes of Mount Erebus. The impact killed everyone aboard. For the people monitoring the flight, there was initially no clear explanation. The aircraft had simply stopped responding. Calls went unanswered. The flight did not appear where expected. And then the realization became unavoidable. Something had happened. Search aircraft began looking across the Antarctic landscape. But Antarctica is enormous, and Mount Erebus is surrounded by a landscape where distance and scale can be difficult to judge. Hours passed. Flight TE901 should have been continuing its journey. Instead, it was silent. Then, close to midnight New Zealand time, search aircraft spotted wreckage on the lower slopes of Mount Erebus. The aircraft had been found. There were no survivors. The scale of the tragedy quickly became clear. All 257 people aboard were dead. New Zealand had lost 200 citizens, along with passengers from several other countries, but finding the wreckage was only the beginning. The recovery operation became one of the most difficult in New Zealand's history. Police, rescue specialists, investigators, scientists, and volunteers traveled to the crash site. They were working in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. The victims had to be recovered and identified. By December 6th, the first aircraft carrying recovered bodies reached Auckland. In total, 213 of the 257 victims were positively identified. Investigators determined that the victims had died from injuries sustained in the initial impact, rather than from the fire that followed. Then came the investigation, and this is where the story became deeply controversial. The first major investigation reached a conclusion that shocked the families. Chief Air Accident Investigator Ron Chippendale identified the probable cause as the captain's decision to continue at low altitude toward an area where the surface and horizon were difficult to define, combined with the crew's inability to detect the rising terrain. In other words, the initial report placed major responsibility on the flight crew, but another investigation would reach a very different conclusion. Justice Peter Mahone led a Royal Commission of Inquiry. He examined thousands of pages of evidence and hundreds of exhibits. Mahone rejected the idea that the pilots were primarily responsible. His conclusion focused on the airline's systems. The route had been changed, the crew had not been informed, and the aircraft had consequently been placed on a path toward Mount Erebus. Mahone described the dominant cause as the programming of the aircraft toward the mountain and the failure to tell the crew, attributing that mistake to inadequate administrative procedures.
The controversy did not end there. Mahone also accused Air New Zealand management of misleading the inquiry. Those accusations were later challenged in court. The Court of Appeal concluded that, concerning those allegations about staff conduct, Mahone had breached natural justice and acted outside his jurisdiction. The Privy Council later upheld that aspect of the Court of Appeal's judgment. But importantly, the legal challenge did not simply erase the broader debate over what caused the crash. The question remained: was this pilot error? Was it an airline systems failure? Or was it a chain of errors in which no single mistake tells the whole story? Today, the Erebus disaster is remembered not as the result of one simple failure, but as a tragedy shaped by multiple contributing factors. A coordinate had been changed, the crew had not been alerted, the flight was conducted at low altitude, the Antarctic environment made visual navigation difficult, and the investigation itself became part of the tragedy, dividing opinions over responsibility for years. In 2019, 40 years after the disaster, New Zealand's government formally apologized to the families of the victims for the actions and failures surrounding the crash, and acknowledged that the pilots were not responsible for the tragedy. The mountain itself still holds the wreckage. The crash site on Mount Erebus has been treated as a place of remembrance and respect. The remains of Flight TE901 are part of the Antarctic landscape now, a permanent reminder of the 257 lives lost there. Flight TE901 began as a sightseeing journey into one of the most beautiful places on Earth. It ended on the side of a mountain that the crew never realized they were flying toward. And perhaps the most unsettling lesson of Erebus is that disasters rarely begin with one dramatic mistake. Sometimes they begin with a small change that nobody notices. If you were investigating Flight 901, where would you place the greatest responsibility? Share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more true stories where history, mystery, and human decisions collide.